Hey, what is going on, everybody out there? This is Jakejames Lugo. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a brand new episode of A Definitive Discussion Rebooted, my series where I bring on various different guests from all over the place and talk about a variety of different things related to gaming and a whole bunch of other cool topics. Today is going to be a fun episode. If you guys haven't seen the previous episodes I've done beforehand, definitely check out the playlist I have on the YouTube channel right now. There's a lot of great topics. There's a lot of great guests on there that I'm pretty sure all of you guys are going to enjoy. But today, we're talking SEGA, we're talking retro stuff, but I had to go get somebody that I thought was awesome, that I could have an awesome conversation with. And I got DreamcastGuy with me as my special guest for the show. So DreamcastGuy, what's good? How you doing? What's happening?
Man, it is a good day to be a Dreamcast fan. Today, as of this recording, we just got the Shenmue HD remasters finally on modern consoles. We got Shenmue 3 news. It is a great day to be a Sega fan.
That's what I'm talking about. The Sega is strong with everybody today, which is pretty cool. And then there's more stuff coming out of Gamescom, which is pretty cool too, because I think it was RetroBit that they started doing some of the different peripherals for both the Genesis and the Saturn. I think at one point, there's a lot of Sega love that's going around.
Definitely those times where I feel like now that retro is becoming cool again, a lot of these companies realize that they have this closet full of cool IPs that we grew up with that they can bring back and we're still going to love.
Yeah, they definitely need to dust off a lot. I mean, they're doing that right now with a lot of different franchises, but there's even more. I feel like, especially with Sega, could kind of go into the vault and kind of just go pull something out of there, or at least pull a name out of a hat. So it'd be kind of cool. But let's talk about Sega itself as a company, throughout the years, consoles, obviously. I grew up as a Sega Genesis kid. That was my whole, I guess you could say, my clan, my faction throughout the original console wars back in the day. And I'm assuming, or at least I'm going with, obviously, it's a little cliche with the name DreamcastGuy, talking Sega and stuff. I would assume that you grew up as a Sega kid as well, correct?
Didn't? No, man. For some reason, in my neighborhood, everybody was pure Nintendo. Like, everybody had the NES, then everybody got the SNES, then everybody got the Nintendo 64. Like, I didn't see a Sega Genesis or a Sega Saturn probably until I was in my 20s.
That's crazy.
The only reason I got a Dreamcast is I happened to go to this party in high school and I just gotten the Game Boy Advanced SP. It had just come out and I had a part-time job. So I bought it and I rented this guy and he was like, oh man, I really want that Game Boy. I'm a big Game Boy collector. I'll give you 100 Dreamcast games and a Dreamcast if you give me that. And so I traded him that night. He happened to have it in his car. And so that really started me on my path of oh, I should get every Dreamcast game. And oh, I should find all these other Sega consoles I've never gotten to play. And there's all these amazing games I didn't get to experience. So it's I've almost been seeing it through the eyes of a historian. It's very fun though.
Yeah, that's interesting because I never really heard it before where, people, again, they get exposed to some of the more bigger popular consoles, especially from their youth back in the day, later on, years later on. And for me, even though I grew up with Genesis, and again, my second console was a Nintendo 64, I never really got into Saturn. I never really got into Dreamcast at the time when it was really popular back in the day. Like you, with some of those other consoles, I went back years later and looked at them and kind of had a different lens to observe everything and stuff. So for you, Dreamcast was really that kind of foray into whatever Sega was at the time like that. But for you, on top of that as well, I want to know when people say Sega, when people talk about Sega in general, what is it usually that you feel is the first few things that they really think about? Because even though it's multifaceted and there's a lot of different aspects and parts to Sega's history that come up, here and there, especially in conversations like this, but what do you feel the common person usually thinks about when they think Sega?
I think common people, they just think of the Sega brand and associates it with Sonic and stuff. But for me, when I think about Sega, I actually think about all their RPGs because I feel like that's something they're not really respected for. But over the years, they've actually made a lot of really weird RPGs, from Phantasy Star to Skies of Arcadia, stuff that's very, very different. It almost feels like Sega was off on an island making RPGs that were so quirky and so different, but so awesome.
Definitely, yeah. And I would even throw in, obviously, Shining Force, and there's many others that people could go through pretty much all the different console catalogs and find some little gems here and there that probably don't even get a lot of the popular shine as what they probably should. I know not too long ago, I just reviewed Beyond Oasis, which is a totally different ARPG. That's again, does some good stuff and has some good elements to it, but it never really got that shine of popularity back in the day, especially during that time frame. The other thing I also want to bring up is that one of the things that a lot of people don't really talk about, and I mean, we're beginning a little bit more of it now, especially with some of the different books coming out from various different publishers, the Master System. I feel like, that's that part of Sega history that kind of is like acknowledged, it's there, but nobody ever really kind of cares about it too much, other than the real big retro heads that are like on YouTube and in forums and stuff. But like in the mainstream, people don't really care so much about Master System. To them, it's really Sega really started with the Genesis, when that's not really true in essence.
It's just because it failed so bad to take off here in America. I've read I've read several of those books about the history of Sega and the early console wars. The Master System managed to get traction over in Europe, so a lot of people over there consider the Master System even bigger to the NES. But man, here in America, like, if you were gaming in the late 80s, you were gaming on an NES. But it's fun to go back to it now. I have a pretty big Master collection, and it's fun. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. Again, like, just going back and playing some of the Master Systems, at least from my perspective, I didn't even think like a lot of the games, especially some of the classics that people really go to, were all that great. I mean, granted, again, it was primitive compared to what we got later on, obviously with the Genesis and the Mega Drive and obviously the Super Nintendo moving forward after that. But for me, I feel like that's just that one aspect of Sega's history that people just kind of is like, okay, it's there, and they kind of just ignore it. The other aspect I think that doesn't get enough credit as much as it should, even though it is credited in a variety of different places, a lot of the arcade stuff, because that's what inspired, I felt like, really kind of kickstarted, or at least was the spark to a lot of the console wars between Nintendo and Sega. Because Sega's whole thing with the Genesis was trying to bring that arcade type of magic to the home console, which you got stuff with like Altered Beast, you got it with a whole bunch of Super Thunder Blade and a whole bunch of other games on the Genesis library and stuff. I mean, do you feel like, at that time frame that Sega at least accomplished what they set out to do?
In a way, I feel like that Sega kept tripping over their own feet, which is where they'd have a great idea and they'd start running with it and they'd get lost in the woods. Like, they definitely were trying to capture that arcade feel. Like, let's face facts, the Genesis had way more like bloody, violent games than the SNES did. And so because of it, it had more true arcade experiences, like Zombies Ate My Neighbors was, of course, more accurate, like, even though that wasn't in arcades. And Mortal Kombat, like, they actually managed to have the correct blood. But then I feel like they started to lose their way because they just didn't know what to port and what not to. I feel like the Genesis really took off in America, though, just because I feel like it was so fast. And I know it's cliche, but man, I feel like when I first got to try a Genesis, I was amazed by how much they could have going on screen and how bright and colorful and flashy all the visuals were.
Yeah, and here's the other thing I'm also curious about, because I have my own opinions about this, but I'm curious about yours. Where do you really feel like that stuff came from? Was it really Sega Japan or Sega of America? Because I feel like the success of the Genesis, especially here in the Western Hemisphere, obviously Sega of America, the marketing and all that big machine and money put into like the advertisements, really is what I felt like make that system, or at least made that system, because a lot of the big classics of that day that really got pushed out, again, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, Sonic the Hedgehog, Altered Beast, and a lot of the other third-party games that were kind of trying to be more edgy, because it fit the culture at the time. It was really, for me, it was what made that console. But where do you stand on that?
I definitely, I think it was the great games all came, because I read the book Console War by Blake Harris, and they really do some, I know, and all those deep dive interviews they did there, they really show the fact that like Sega of Japan knew everything about game development. They really had mastered the cycle of production and, okay, we want this game to have this tone and be aimed towards this demographic, but they had no idea about marketing. So I really think that the reason these games found their footing and got successful and got as many sequels as they did was because Sega of America was willing to go the edgy route and put on like real controversial commercials that were like, Nintendo sucks. So I feel like that the reason we got so many big games is definitely because of Sega of America.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also they were like really the first company that I could think of, within that time frame and even beforehand, was the one that was trying to be so blunt about what they wanted to do. They wanted competition with Nintendo. They were like that kid that just went up to the big kid in the playground and just smacked him in the face. Almost. It felt like, at least, through the marketing and through the way that they presented themselves. But also, I want to know, do you feel like, that clash between Sega of America and Sega Japan, which is what the book refers to, and they kind of talk about it, in various different points. A lot of different disagreements going on, especially with games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 at the time. Do you feel like that was one of the bigger contributing factors to why things ended up turning out the way they did, past the Genesis into the Saturn and eventually into the Dreamcast?
No, I don't think the clash ended up screwing them over in the end. I think it was that Sega of America in the end started to lose focus of what gamers wanted. Like, if you hear some interviews where they talked about like why there weren't as many RPGs on the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast is just because Sega of America thought that people weren't interested in RPGs, despite the fact that if you look at the sales records of Final Fantasy VII, which probably launched the original PlayStation into orbit with sales, like Sega of America just did not know directly what people wanted. So Sega was making great stuff. Like, I'm obsessed with the original Grandia. The original Grandia exists on the Sega Saturn, but only in Japan. And it's nuts to me. It's like stuff like that. If they brought that over like fans were demanding, I definitely think those things would have been a lot more successful, and they might still be around as a console maker today.
I think also part of it has to do a little closed-mindedness because they were trying to be so anti-Nintendo. They were trying to be the polar opposite of what Nintendo was doing at the time, both with the NES, with the Super Nintendo, and I think even arguably with the N64. And you could even throw in there with the GameCube, not the GameCube, the Game Gear and the Game Boy at that time frame, that they were trying to be so completely different, at least, finding a lot of success on the Genesis time frame with being so the complete opposite of what Nintendo was doing. I felt like maybe they just ran that into the ground too much. And again, not even knowing too much of the Saturn's library like that, moving into the Dreamcast, I still felt a little bit of that as we got into some of the other consoles right up to the point where they stopped making them.
Yeah, definitely. The way you phrase it as anti-Nintendo is a good way to put it. Like, a lot of people don't know this, but when the original Game Boy came out, all the technology existed for full color screens. They made it black and white so it'd be cheaper and have a better battery life.
Yeah.
But then Sega comes along and they're like, oh, well, you guys aren't going to use this really edgy, cutting edge technology. We're going to use it. And then the Game Gear became famous for having like a 30-minute battery life. And so it's like pitfalls like that where they tried to swerve in the opposite direction just to see what the market would chase, like if the market could sustain it, and they ended up sinking themselves by swerving off the road.
Yeah, a lot of business decisions I noticed that were like that. Even when because back in the day when the original PlayStation was getting off the ground, when Sony was trying to get into the console business, they obviously went to Nintendo first, and we all know how that story played out. Things just didn't go through. There was even stories about Sega trying to pair up, or at least partner up with Sony, at least trying to do their version again of like a disc-based console and stuff. And things didn't quite turn out the way that they were supposed to. But like Sega making those decisions was like, oh, okay, Nintendo's doing this, let's do the opposite of that. Oh, Nintendo screwed up on this, let's actually be the ones that made this work and get that perception or get that, that attention on us, both from the media and also from consumers at the time. What do you think, though, moving on from, going from the Genesis and the Mega Drive, going into Saturn and eventually Dreamcast, did you feel like the games overall, whether, besides like the lack of RPGs and stuff, do you feel like they got better with time, or at least they got better, with better like types of design or better types of games and the content wise, compared to what was going on with Nintendo back then?
Yes, and I think it's just because Sega developers definitely seemed more willing to do real daring projects. Like, when I think of some of the more obscure games on Sega Saturn, like Mr. Bones, which is like a third-person shooter, and then a rhythm game where you're having to play like a guitar and drums to beat off like legions of zombies, and then you go to something like Astal, which is a hand-drawn, side-scrolling platformer with all sorts of interesting evolving combat. Games like that are so far out there that I think that audiences weren't quite sure what to do with it. But when it comes to like library of games, I think the Sega Saturn is a monster of awesome stuff. But even more so the Dreamcast. Like, obviously, I own every Dreamcast game ever made. I've beaten every Dreamcast game, and I love them. It's just, I think the Dreamcast managed to just, totally change the game.
I think also here in America, we kind of got a little bit shafted with some of the marketing stuff. And I felt like the Saturn maybe would have done a little bit better if we would have had that same type of marketing, that marketing approach that they got in Japan with Segata Sanshiro. Because I felt like that guy and that actor became such a caricature and such like an iconic like association with that console in Japan that it ended up, really resonating with a lot of people. And obviously because, the Japanese audience is a little bit different from the Western audience, we didn't have that same type of like caricature or same type of like thing we could latch onto with the console here in America. Obviously besides because a lot of those other factors contributed from like the 32X, coming off of the Genesis, and obviously dealing with the Sega CD and all those other things that kind of like made a hodgepodge of disaster a little bit, moving on. So it's the later ends of Sega and stuff. But I also agree with you that some of the games I think got a little bit ridiculous and a lot more quirky, but also interesting because that, at least to me, showed that Sega was at least pushing the envelope as far as gaming being an art form. I mean, look at Seaman on the Dreamcast. Seaman on the Dreamcast is like a really weird game. It's really out there. That's not something I would have ever expected on any other platform. But again, it just happened to show up on a Sega console.
Shenmue, like obviously Shenmue is one of my favorite games ever made. And if you try and explain that to somebody, it's like, well, it's sort of a detective game, but you just wander around and talk to people. And if you want, you can go to the arcade and play games. And if you tried to tell somebody in 1999 that the best part about this game is that you can play games in it, like they wouldn't even understand. Like at that point, they were so far ahead of Nintendo in conceptual like design ideas that nobody could even grasp it. Like I honestly think that in some ways, Sega was too far ahead of the curve for their own good.
I partially disagree with that because I think at the time frame, again, that the N64, if I got my dates right, the N64 was already out on the market by the time obviously Dreamcast was around, or at least Saturn was around and Dreamcast. So we had the PlayStation 1, we didn't have the PlayStation 2 yet, but then we had the Dreamcast and we had the N64. And we were getting games like Super Mario 64, we were getting games like The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, etc. So I felt like if you're talking about design, I felt like they were just on two different playing fields. Like I think Nintendo was playing a different type of game where obviously they focused on a fun factor and really appealing to that family audience and stuff. But I feel like Sega was the one that was bold enough to at least have weird and quirky ideas, or at least be willing to kind of like throw stuff at the wall and see what stuck. And I don't think Nintendo was willing to do that at the time.
Like look at Phantasy Star Online. Like Phantasy Star Online, it's if you go back and actually try and explain it to people, just the idea, the fact that it was an online MMORPG basically way before anything other than like EverQuest existed. It had these cool lobbies and an auto translation system, so you could actually communicate with people anywhere on the planet. You're fighting these big bosses and getting cool loot. In the age of dial-up, like that stuff like that is just so like pretty so insane. Out there. I love it.
Definitely. Now, obviously, you know the Dreamcast in and out. You live and breathe the Dreamcast. It's in your name. It's in your blood, practically at this point. So, in your professional, personal opinion, okay, outside of obviously the obvious facts that out there, you know, dealing with piracy at the time, because that was like really in its infantile stages and there was no real way to kind of stop that back then. What do you feel like was the one thing that really contributed to the ending of, you know, the Dreamcast and Sega getting out of the console market? What do you think was the real big reason of why that happened?
My opinion on this is totally different from everybody else in the community, but I totally 100% stand by this. I think that if Sega had taken the extra 6 months to put a DVD drive in the Dreamcast, it would have been way more successful. Sure. I think that the fact that not only is the DVD drive able to produce better graphics and hold more data so you can have bigger games and more clear audio, but the biggest thing is a huge chunk of free marketing for the PS2 was the fact that since it was the cheapest DVD player on the planet, every single storefront had PS2s sitting in the windows just to show like Matrix DVDs and stuff. Like everywhere you looked, you were completely saturated with PS2 imagery. People were picking up a PS2 just to be able to watch like My Cousin Vinny in HD and then later on getting Final Fantasy X. Like I definitely think that if they just taken that extra time to put a DVD drive in there, it would have lasted years longer, if not gotten a sequel console.
I agree. I think that the optics of that, obviously for the PlayStation 2, really worked to its benefit because you look at it as like a DVD player that could play games. And you just look at the Dreamcast at the time, it was just a game player that could also apparently go online through Ethernet. And I think that, you know, a lot of the general public wasn't ready for that. You know, this was way before, obviously, the original Xbox Live and all that stuff. That hadn't really been shown, or at least, you know, given a lot of weight to it or a lot of emphasis. So even though the Dreamcast, I felt like, was still ahead of its time, like really offering great stuff, again, like you mentioned, Phantasy Star Online and some of the other games that kind of, you know, utilize that in some way. It just didn't have that appeal at the current moment that could work. And I felt like, I think you're right, where if it had a DVD player, or at least, you know, some makings of a DVD player and was marketed to have that feature as well, I think both the PlayStation 2 and the Dreamcast could have gone toe for toe for a lot longer. And again, I don't even think that Sega would have gotten out of the console business.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, I feel like porting would have been a little bit easier. A lot of people forget this now, but a big problem of the Dreamcast is that it was so far ahead technologically that people didn't know what to port to it, which is why if you look at its library, there are a ton of PS1 ports that they just like bumped up to HD, and then like Nintendo 64 ports were on the Dreamcast, which is such a huge waste of its overall potential. I feel like if it had had a DVD drive, you would have seen those early games that were very low power, and then as it progressed into the PS2 era, we would have seen games that were cross-platform. You would have seen more stuff like Dead or Alive 2, which ended up running better on Dreamcast than it even did on PS2. You would have seen more of that.
Now, with the Dreamcast, though, do you think that also some consumers were maybe a little bit intimidated or a little bit kind of like out of whack with some of the way that the hardware looked or some of the peripherals and stuff? Because when you really look at the PlayStation 2 and the Dreamcast side by side, right, and you look at obviously like controllers and all these other peripherals that it has, obviously the PlayStation 2 has a much more sleeker look to it. Without knowing any of its features or any of this other stuff, it looks a little bit much more fine-tuned to whatever audience is trying to appeal to. And if you look at the Dreamcast, obviously you have the little memory units that go into the controllers, the cords and stuff that it obviously comes on the bottom instead of the top. Like there's other little different design things that just make it inherently different. That has I guess you could say a different type of appeal. Do you think that also probably contributed to probably, obviously the PlayStation 2 doing a little bit better than the Dreamcast at the time?
I don't. So there's a term in sociology called Flintstoneization, which is where you take your current knowledge and you accidentally apply it to the past. And I think we're doing that a tiny bit here, which is that we have been staring at the PlayStation controller for so long now that it makes perfect sense. Whereas in the past, there were people who actually would complain about getting hand cramps because of the weird, like, cylindrical design of the PS1 and PS2 controllers. Whereas the Dreamcast controller at the time was complimented because it did have a more relaxed hand set to it. But yeah, the VMU was weird, and the fact that it only had one joystick definitely hurt it. I think that Sega was working up to the idea of the Dreamcast controller for a long time. If you look at the later controllers of the Sega Saturn, some of the later models look just like a Dreamcast controller. Like you could tell that they were trying to get like their audience adjusted to it. It just didn't happen fast enough.
Now, one other thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is obviously the characters, the mascots of Sega, because I feel like this is also important too. And again, really kind of looking back at that time frame, even before the Dreamcast, during the console wars between Genesis and Super Nintendo, obviously people had a lot of, different comparisons between characters and mascots. Obviously, Sonic and Mario being the most, like, obviously prominent. Those were like the face of the console wars back then. Why do you feel like the Sega characters, any of the characters, whether it's Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, or any of the other characters from any franchise that Sega developed throughout the years, never really caught on with the masses in the same way that maybe Nintendo's franchises did?
I think it comes down to iconography, which is that so much about Mario is easily understandable. You don't need to know his backstory. He doesn't really talk. He's just kind of makes some like whoops and yells. And it's the same way with Link. Like as soon as you look at Link, you see the Hylian symbol on his shield. You see his sword. Like just by looking at these people, they are so readily apparent. Whereas a lot of stuff in the Sega cabal isn't quite as clear. Like if you look at Biggs the Cat, they clearly wanted Biggs the Cat to be a bigger character. But if you just look at it, it's like, why is a cat fishing? Like how did you expect this to be a brand? And I feel like they kept having that happen. Like you could tell that early on in the Genesis, they really wanted Vector Man to be their own version of Mega Man. Definitely. But if you look at Mega Man, you can see like, okay, this is a little kid with a robot body who does like a cool jump shot, and he's trying to fight evil robots that are slightly more powerful, and it gets their parts and adds them on. Like if you look at Vector Man, he's literally a series of balls with balls for eyes.
But doesn't that have like a certain flair to it and a uniqueness to it? Like even I would even go as far as like looking at the dwarf from like Golden Axe. To me, that could be like a character that could really resonate, and it immediately gets associated with Sega. And I would even say the same thing about Vector Man in that regard. But it still seems like, despite their style, despite like their different flair and their designs and stuff, it just never really clicked with people. And again, you could still have that one-to-one comparison with different franchises from Nintendo. But I feel like for whatever reason, they just never just latched onto everybody. Or everybody just gravitated towards whatever games. Do you think it's more due to the character designs or more because of the games that they were associated with?
Part of it is design. I think it's that if you, a lot of history books, they talk about the fact that Nintendo very much based their early art on anime, like giant eyes and stuff like that. So if you even look at a shrunken down version of the character, you can easily see facial features and expressions. And like, you can see that same thing is sort of done in the voice acting. Like you don't need to see Link's face. When you hear his yell, you know that he's scared because he's falling off a cliff or something. I feel like Sega characters never managed to do that. Like Sega characters never seem to have the gambit of emotion. And so because of it, like in any form of design, I just feel like they didn't quite nail it. I love Sega characters, but I'm just saying that they're not as instantly approachable in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think also the majority of them, since you mentioned an anime style or at least anime inspiration for Nintendo characters. A lot of them took a more realistic approach. And I think that goes back to the wanting to be completely different from Nintendo type of thing. Because, I mean, look at the box arts for a lot of the Genesis games, you know, Saturn or Dreamcast games. They try to take a much more realistic approach. Very similar in some ways to what you saw with the original PlayStation when Sony was really getting off the ground and stuff. The other thing I also want to ask you, and I feel like now it is the best way to kind of cap everything off, you know, now that Sega is a third-party developer, third-party publisher across all platforms at this point, they're not in the hardware business anymore. Do you feel like, you know, it's been the best decision for them, or at least they've been doing well for themselves? Because they've had a lot of ebbs and flows, and there's a lot of changes that have happened over the last, like 20 plus years at this point.
I think that they're in a very different spot, and Sega is much, much smaller than they ever were, but I think they're in a good spot. I talk to a lot of people inside of Sega now, and I think that for the first time in like the last 10 years, they find themselves in a spot where they have a lot of interesting franchises that people like. Like Yakuza has finally started to find its footing and it's taking off. Like the Sonic All-Stars racing games, like the new one's about to come out, and people are so hotly anticipating
Sonic Mania.
Like, yeah, seeing a revival of a lot of stuff, and the fact that they're even digging up Shenmue for an HD collection, and from what I'm hearing on Twitter, it's selling out at stores. Like, people are lining up to buy that. Like, clearly they're in a space now where they've managed to find a lot of love and a lot of money, honestly. So even though they're not giant and they'll never be a billion-dollar corporation again, I think they're very happy with what they've done.
Yeah, I don't think you'll ever have that same level of excitement or hype that what you got back in the 90s for Sega as a company, because again, it was a different time, and I feel like the company presented themselves in a different way that worked for that particular point in time. Now things have changed so much, and obviously I don't even think it has anything to do with them not being a hardware manufacturer anymore. It's just that you don't get that same resonance, you don't get that same outlook as them. I feel like what Sega was back then, you know, or at least some of their aspects or characteristics and attributes, you find that a lot more now with Sony, and even I would argue Microsoft to some extent, you know, because again, the landscape has changed so differently. Do you think that maybe there's a little bit of just kind of like holding on too much to that nostalgia for a lot of people, hoping to have that same type of perception of them again?
Yes. Yeah, if anything, it's one of those like the demons of their past haunt them type of thing, is that they made so many good games over the years, especially in like the early 2000s with stuff like Skies of Arcadia. I feel like people really want them to go back to that, and I feel like that kind of haunts them because they don't want to go back to that. Like, I think Sega, despite the fact that they are so much smaller, is very pleased with how things have ended up. Like, they've created interesting brands that continue to pay their bills. So I think that they're going to constantly live in the shadow of what they once were, though.
True, I agree. They're never going to really kind of get over, like, again, they were better back then than what they are now. At least that's the perception of a lot of people, especially younger gamers now that maybe didn't even grow up within that era. But regardless, though, Dreamcast Guy, thank you for chatting it up with me about Sega. It was fun. It was dope. Where can everybody find you right now? Where can everybody find you on social media? Where are you at?
YouTube.com/DreamcastGuy. I'm also on Twitter, and I like to tweet a lot about gaming news and stuff. And I'm working all sorts of big projects. If you want to see something Sega related, actually coming up here in just a couple days, Thursday morning, I'm finally allowed to release my review of Yakuza Kiwami 2. Yep. It is like 11 minutes. It's super in-depth. So if you want to see me talk about mini games and punching people, definitely check that out.
Any other cool projects you got coming down the pipeline besides that? You know, the stuff that maybe you could give everybody a hint about?
That I'm working on right now that's also filling up all my hours, and the reason I haven't gotten much sleep is I'm also working on a giant review for the 28th about Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, which has like 130 bosses in it. So I'm trying to like work my way through. Yeah, I'm trying to work my way through like a 100-hour long game right now. So I am not getting any rest, but I promise I'm very happy, and it should be a very good video that'll be up on the 28th.
Very cool. You're going to need some extra coffee. It sounds like you're going to need a couple more cups for all of this. But thank you, Dreamcast Guy, for chatting up with me on the show. Guys, all that stuff that we just mentioned now, that Dreamcast Guy just mentioned, there'll be links in the description box below so you could go directly to it. Leave me a comment down below about this episode if you guys enjoyed it, if you guys enjoyed the conversation, or if you have suggestions of different guests or different topics you guys want us to touch on the show. Don't forget to leave a like on this video, as well as also subscribe to my YouTube channel for all my videos that I have on here, including episodes like this, including new reviews, and a whole bunch of other great content I'm pretty sure all of you guys will enjoy. With that being said, we will talk to you again very soon. Peace out, and stay epic, everybody.